right. Hey, Credera family. Hope everyone's doing well on this Thursday. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to welcome everyone to our latest edition of the Credera Listens panel. So since its inception, Credera Listens has been an opportunity for us to bring our broader community together, talk about a variety of topics. Now, over the next hour or so, we'll be continuing on themes around racism, allyship, anti-racism, as well as diversity and inclusion as a whole. Now, today's focus, we're going to be keying in and spotlighting the Asian experience in America. So really excited to be sharing this content with all of you. And we have a really fantastic set of panelists that are ready to share their stories. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Justin Mah, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's panel. I'm a senior manager in the management consulting practice, and I work out of our New York City GO. Just a little about me. I have a passion for storytelling. I like to hear things. I want to be a good listener, but really the key is I like celebrating the diversity, which really makes all of us unique. So hearing those perspectives, I feel just makes the experience and living life a lot more richer. So excited, and I feel very fortunate to be here with all of you. And again, thanks to everybody for taking time out of all of your days to join us here to hear a little bit more about these topics that we'll be sharing with all of you today. So just to give everybody a little bit of a lay of the land for the session, I'm going to start off with a series of questions that we're going to be running through with the panelists to get everybody's stories and to hear their sides. But I want to encourage for those of you that are in the audience, there is a chat panel which is enabled here. So if any of you have questions or things that you are interested in, please feel free to ping the chat, and Alex Moore will be monitoring those as they come through. And what we'll do is as we go through, we're hoping that we'll have some time and on the back end of the hour that we can look through and talk through some of those questions and hopefully cover and address those as they come through. So again, for those as a takeaway, I'm hoping that this panel gives everybody an opportunity to create more empathy and understanding, and specifically or kind of a recognition of the Asian American experience through today's lens. Now with that, without further ado, I would really like to introduce our esteemed panelists for today. So first off, we have Kathy Butler. Kathy is the Chief Executive Officer at Organic. She's been the CEO of Organic since 2019, where she brings over 20 years of marketing and technology experience. At Organic, she's helped name brands such as PepsiCo, Amex, and J&J pave their path to becoming digital-first businesses. Currently, she is the executive sponsor for the OPMG Anti-Racism, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion cross-agency team. She leads the education workstream, and she believes deeply in skills development. Kathy's work and leadership has seen her honored as the 2021 Female Frontier Award recipient by Campaign US for leading charge in creative. Kathy, welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Next up, we have John Gim. John is the Global Chief Marketing Sciences Officer of WRAP. So at WRAP, John leads a diverse and seasoned practice which encompasses experience, media, and advanced analytics. Over the course of his career, his focus has been on producing and delivering effective and sound solutions that leverage technology, data, and analytics. Passionate about transparency and growth in the data science space, he lends his time serving on WRAP's ICOMS Data Science Board and its Global Consumer Trust Council. So John, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, next up, we have Lou. Lou is a Crederian. So Lou is a partner at Credera, an influential and transformational driven leader. Lou comes to the table with over 20 years of experience in digital strategy, design, and development. Prior to joining Credera, Lou held key leadership positions at digital tech firm Globin and Southwest Airlines. Personal passions of his include community service as well as nonprofit work centered around homelessness and enabling youth education. So Lou, good to see you.
Yeah, good to see everybody.
All right, last but certainly not least, we have Ryan Chan. Ryan is an associate design director here at Credera. As a leader, Ryan delivers value for his clients by combining design thinking skills with well-crafted digital experiences. His areas of expertise include digital product design, design strategy, user research, and branding. Outside of the work environment at Credera, Ryan is a co-founder of Foundation 649, a nonprofit organization with a mission to discover and empower young, talented Asian Americans, which is great. Passion for storytelling to promote empathy. In his minimal free time, Ryan can be found cultivating his aspirations as a visual artist and illustrator. So welcome, Ryan.
Hello, Credera family. Excited to be a part of this panel.
All right, so that is our esteemed panelist crew. So what we'll do is let's dive right in. So what I'd like to start off with here is I want to hear a little bit more about your respective personal journeys. So if each of you can share a bit more about not only maybe your journey, but a little bit about your family history. Are you a first generation Asian American, or did you emigrate here? And if so, where from? And I'd like to start with Kathy. Kathy, do you mind teeing us up?
Yeah, no worries. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm a first generation Asian American. I was born in Los Angeles. And really the only person in my family having been born in LA. My parents, brother and sister, emigrated from Hong Kong, born and raised in Hong Kong, and moved to the US in 1970. And I was born not long after that. My experience of growing up in LA was quite idyllic. I was surrounded by Asian people all the time, had a wonderful, wonderful cultural upbringing. Yeah, at the same time, had a very modern experience from kind of coming from an immigrant family. My mom was a super driver in the family. She was very much thinking about how to help us feel comfortable in assimilating into American culture, and wondering aloud all the time of what it meant to be an American. So I got both a traditional background and also a really modern view of what it meant to be Asian American at the time. I went to school. I moved to New York when I was 17 to pursue probably a very untraditional experience of being a music journalist. And from there, I actually had a pretty winding road to where I am now. And I also got a practical degree in being a teacher. So when I talk about a passion point of mine being skills development, it's really focused on learning the things you need to learn in order to land your dream job, which for me meant learning the business of the business kind of wherever I was. And that really paid off. And it's an exciting time, I think, to be Asian, and a very optimistic view, because I think the future is incredibly bright. And also there comes a huge responsibility, certainly that I feel, to mentor and to help give opportunity to Asians so that we can really create the next generation of leadership.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kathy. Ryan, you want to go next?
Yeah, so to answer the question, I'm a first generation Taiwanese American. Both of my parents are from Taiwan. My dad was born in Taipei. And for those who kind of don't really know the history, Taiwan has their wave of Chinese immigrants from China, during the Civil War. So my dad came from that side. My mom is from Southern Taiwan. So her family was born and raised in Taiwan underneath Japanese immigration or colonialism. But yeah, I grew up in Dallas. My parents moved after college to pursue a master's at Pensacola, and then came to Dallas for work. And I grew up in a suburb called Plano. I think people in Dallas kind of know, but it's at least during the 90s, there was, a wave of, Asian immigrants there. And so I grew up around a lot of my fellow Asian American peers. I went to a Chinese church growing up. And so I had sort of that experience of kind of being a minority, like with the majority of, white culture around me, but kind of had, Chinese church and Chinese school, all of that experience to kind of foster my identity and growth in that.
That sounds great. Thank you, Ryan. Lou, you want to go next?
Yeah, so I grew up in the beautiful country of Oklahoma. I was actually born in Malaysia. My parents were Vietnamese immigrants, and they were boat people. So my parents got separated in the ocean when they left, and I was born in Malaysia. Gosh, like a couple weeks after they left Vietnam. So some jokes about me possibly being born in the ocean for my family. That still goes today, but we came to America when I was 3 months old, 2 or 3 months old. So I pretty much, from my earliest memories, have been in this country. So growing up in Oklahoma, as you guys can imagine, it's pretty, it's a great blue collar state, Tulsa specifically, but diversity was somewhat limited. And then specifically, I grew up in the suburbs of Tulsa, where primarily, I joke my dad all the time, he picked the wrong suburb because most of the Asians lived in another suburb, and I was one of only 3 Asians in my graduating class of 1,100 students, and I didn't know those other 2 until I saw them walking down the graduation podium. So very much a homogeneous culture. Went to University of Oklahoma, majored in management information systems, which is not doctor, lawyer, or engineer, but close enough to one of those that my parents were pretty happy about it. And then eventually moved down to Dallas, and so for work after college. So my experience has been pretty, I feel like, assimilated in America. I think the conflicts I had growing up were mostly around just trying to bridge my parents' mentorship and support in the way that they do it with what I was seeing in real life growing up. Because obviously you can imagine the advice that they give or gave was out of care and love, but sometimes it just didn't land well with what you're dealing with in school. And so I think being a first generation growing up here, having to navigate that was always hard. But one thing my dad did say to me that always resonated when I was a kid was, even though he didn't understand the culture, was take the best of both. You're able to see both and take the best. And I always remembered that, and it has served me really well. And as I got older, instead of feeling insecure about the differences, I started really appreciating the differences. And I think that served me in my work, as I got to meet, other people of diverse backgrounds. And in my career, and similar to Kathy, I feel like in my position, it's in all of us, it's an opportunity to serve and give back based on what you've gone through. So that's my answer.
Thank you for sharing that, Lou.
Absolutely.
John, what about your story?
Yeah, so I think like some of the folks on the call, I'm first gen here, Korean American. The opposite sort of coast to coast as Kathy. I was born in Philly. Parents lived in Philly and North Jersey. I live in LA now. So I grew up pretty much up until college in the Philadelphia area. And I think growing up, my parents came to the US really for the American dream because they're having kids, they're ready to have kids. So I have an older brother. He fulfilled sort of all the duties of a first gen, first male born. So he was sort of that doctor, lawyer, engineer camp, went to an Ivy League school, did all the stuff that they really wanted him to do, whether he liked it or not. I had a bit more freedom growing up because of that. And so I think one of the key pieces for me growing up was my parents wanted to emphasize being Korean American. So Korean first, American second. And I think in some odd way, I wanted to be American Korean, sort of American first and Korean second. And I think that's a common thing of trying to figure out what that mix looks like, what that balance looks like. I went to school at Carnegie Mellon. So in terms of sort of the more as what Asians are good at type of stuff, I think I lend itself to that stereotype a little bit. But post that, I think, I've worked sort of in the field that I studied in economics and statistics for most of my career, but also took some time off to go abroad. Lived in Cambodia for about 2 years, did some work there, and also played some cards for a bit. So I think kind of an interesting, just random time to do what I wanted in the middle of the career. So yeah, that's kind of my story. So yeah.
I think it's interesting hearing these, what we could say tropes, the lawyer, doctor, engineer, the technical, or the, you know what, you go to school for reason X, and when you come out, you will be reason X. So I feel like we'll address some of those items again hopefully a little bit later. But I like to hear these themes too, because I think when we hear about Asian and American, even though the word is together, I think a lot of times, maybe some from our experiences, those are kind of separate things at times, and I feel like that kind of comes out through from my experience as well. My parents both emigrated from Hong Kong. They came, I would say, a little bit younger than we would expect. My father came around high school. My mom came around middle school. So I would say for them, they assimilated quite well, I would say. So, you know, their English is they can speak quite well, they can communicate. So I feel like, and then we moved to the suburbs quite early. I've always been a suburban kid. So I always felt like my experience was, if anything, I was American. I thought of myself as just being American. But at the same time, when I was 5 years old, my mom decided to join the local Chinese school to teach on Saturdays. And she said, I'm going there, you're coming with me too. And I did not want to. I said, all my friends are playing soccer. I don't want to do that. And she's like, well, you're not going to be good at sports anyway. So, and she said, you're going to come with me to Chinese school. So that became almost to me, kind of looking back on it, it almost became a little bit of an identity crisis for me, because it was like Monday through Friday, it was literally, hey, you know, make sure you're focusing in American school, and then you're going to Chinese school on Saturdays. So a lot of times, my friends didn't understand, hey, how come you can never hang out with us on Saturdays? And I was like, well, I'm going to the school. They're like, why are you going to school that's not normal school? And then so I said, well, I'm going to learn Chinese. And they're like, why? And then so, and I asked myself that same question for all the 10 years or so. And I noticed that's, to me, it almost like I almost had to hide that portion of what happened on the weekends. You know, if I'm going to, you know, learn about this, but then go hang out with my grandparents. So I felt like I was living kind of this dual life, and then not having them kind of converge together. So, you know, that's kind of a little bit of my perspective, and I think you'll see some of that come out in some of the things or some of how that's kind of shaped some of my thinking around some of these broader topics that I'm hoping that we can cover as well. Right. So yeah, thanks. That's just a little bit about me. Thanks for everybody for sharing that. So I want to transition over into kind of more around race as a whole. So hearing about a little bit about everyone's journey, but I'm curious what your respective exposures to race, or, you know, as an Asian, when was maybe the first time you felt like maybe you were different compared to your peers or to your community? So Lou, I'd like to go with you, tee it up to you. Anything you can share on that front?
Thank you, Justin. I appreciate your story too, man. You know, it's early. I mean, I think I would assume for a lot of us, you know, even as children, I think you look different, right? And it's, you know, kids are pretty observant. And so I think in elementary, maybe even, you know, you got the slanty-eyed comments and this and that. I think it just starts making you realize there's something different, even though you know you look different, but you didn't think about it until someone says it. So I think early elementary, you know, benignly, you know, kids would say stuff, or joke because they just don't know any better. But those are indelible marks that I think as a kid you start picking up, and you start figuring out, kind of like what you said, Justin, when there are cultural differences in your family or you personally, and your friends called out, even out of pure just organic ignorance, you just start feeling like kind of a gap between you and someone else. And I think I like the way you said it. You do. I realize I try to mask some of that or downplay it, just so that I could know how to fit in, and that. Navigating that, you know, as a kid was tough at times, but I think it also was helpful to understand. Some of it was more than anything else, that knowing that people were ignorant about it. So I think probably young age kids, and then when I played, similar to you, I played sports in high school, and that's probably the most racism I encountered was playing sports. It's crazy, right? I mean, I don't think they've ever seen at the time, freshman 5'4" point guard. So I think it was something that on the court, I got a lot of racial comments from other players and whatnot. And it just fueled me at that point. I thought, you know, you're in competition, and then family didn't understand too. And I think that was something that you had to deal with. But I think that racial tension has always been there since a kid.
What about you, Ryan?
Yeah, similar to kind of what Lou was saying, I was fortunate enough to grow up in, a school where there were kind of already a lot of minority students, a lot from, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, China. And so like when I was growing up in elementary school, like, it was one of those things where you like start to kind of realize like, oh, hey, that person's house is like more like my house than, going to a white person's house. The food is different and the culture is different and all these different things. I do remember like very distinctly in fourth grade, because I was thinking about this question. I was pulled out of my class by our ESL teacher. I wasn't even in ESL, so this is the funny disclaimer. So the ESL teacher pulled me out of class to take like an English proficiency test, which was weird because I was born here. I speak better English than I do Chinese. And I remember walking to this class and it was all these other Asian Americans, all of some of my friends. And we all looked at each other. This is fourth grade. And we looked at each other. We're like, why are we taking this test? It was the easiest test too. It was like basic English. But I think at that point, I remember that was like when it clicked to me that I was like, oh, I am different. I'm not like they're doing this to double check just to make sure that I'm okay. And I actually shared this story with my wife. She also grew up in Plano, similar to me. And she was like, yeah, that happened to me too. And I was like, well, that's so strange. And so I think from then on, I kind of wasn't the standard Asian American. I didn't excel in school. I loved art, I loved music. So a lot of the racism, it wasn't actually, there were like things here and there, like in school where I was in regulars classes and they'd be like, hey, why are you the only Asian kid? And like, you're Asian, you're supposed to be good at math, you're supposed to be good at science. And I was like, I guess I'm the bad batch, I'm the black sheep, and there was that tension for me, at least. I wanted to fit in with Asian Americans, but I couldn't academically. And there was that tension too that I couldn't fit in with Americans. I couldn't fit in with Asian Americans. I didn't really know where I fit. And that was kind of a weird tension for me. Now I'm very thankful to have this job and my parents are not stressed out for me anymore. But yeah, definitely those kinds of experiences really kind of helped me start to think about race at a younger age.
Kathy or John, did you encounter this early or was this later? What about from your perspectives?
John, you want to go?
Sure. Yeah, I think for me, I sort of had three pockets that I grew up in. So I grew up initially in West Philly, which is a predominantly Black community. And like our church that I went to, which was a immigrant planted church, was right in the middle of West Philly. So we were very used to kind of latchkey kids just being out and about. So that was sort of our entry into like culture in US. But my school, as my parents moved around, was probably much more white. And then sort of my immediate friends at church were all Korean. So I had these like pockets of friends. So it was sort of, depending on who I was with, you either felt like you were a representative from another racial demographic or you felt like you were with your peers. And so I think that lasted for quite a while until that all smashes together in college because you don't have the ability to separate those pieces in college. And so, but I've never been in a situation in a school, et cetera, where it's predominantly Asian. So I think for me, that's never been the case where I've had friends that grew up in South Jersey or other places where their school's like 30% Korean, Korean American. So I think in that sense, from an early age, depending on what I was doing, as Lou was saying, whether it's playing sports, whether it's you're just out, you'll hear things, react to things. So I think at a very early age, you're different because you're interacting so much with the people around you. But I think it wasn't until college that you have to deal with all that together. Like I could be sort of a version of myself in different places to kind of assimilate better. But I think as I got older, it's sort of figuring out who you are identity-wise so that you don't sort of play different hats.
So can I ask? Oh, sorry.
It's a totally different experience, actually, because I grew up right outside of LA. that it was predominantly Asian. So it felt very homogenous in that way. And then I went to college in New York, which, so many different people that I felt right at home. And this is going to sound terrible, so let me just caveat by saying the intent of that is I didn't really feel different until I met my husband's family. My husband's white family from South Jersey. They're the best people. Let me just repeat that. They are a wonderful, wonderful family. We've been married for a long time. But they just hadn't had a lot of exposure to non-white people. So the first time going to church, the first time going to family events, when I got pregnant, it was all very key moments of, I wonder what your baby is going to look like, or being the only person in church sitting in the pew, being Asian and not going to get the cracker thing. I just all new experiences in that way, not intentionally trying to make me feel different, but very obviously so. I was different, and trying to bring me into their culture while still recognizing, oh, happy Chinese New Year, or, things like that, it didn't really occur to me that assimilation experience into marrying, a wonderful, wonderful family would feel so different. Yet at the same time, it actually made me double down on our culture even more. And raise our children, our biracial children, with so much strength in the Chinese culture.
That's really interesting. Yeah, interesting perspectives too. Mine's different as well. Growing up, I did go to Chinese school, so of course I knew, some of the Chinese community. I knew there was a Korean community, but I did want to share that I didn't realize until college about more about Vietnamese culture, Laotian culture, Filipino culture, and just there's so many Asians covers such a vast space, right? So it's almost like, if you say European, it doesn't just mean it's German or French. There's so many other aspects of that. And I think it was interesting when I went to college, I actually felt kind of a little bit of racism amongst the Asian community because I joined the Asian Association, and they didn't realize that I spoke Chinese. So I heard a lot of students actually talking about me, and they called me Juk Sing, which means kind of like the American. And I've heard people call me. There's a term, they say you're a Twinkie or a banana, where you're yellow on the outside but you're white on the inside, and it's not said in a pleasant way. It's actually supposed to be an insult to others. So it was very interesting when they found out that I did speak Chinese, and I actually spoke to them. I said, hey, I understand what you're saying, so if you don't mind, I would appreciate it if you didn't talk about me. Just let's talk to each other like humans at the time. And I didn't realize that until then, where it's there's almost like this little bit of infighting too. And I think part of this is hopefully we can grow out of that. There are a lot of these inherent biases that already exist, and that's just within the Asian community itself. So when you kind of bubble that up to a macro level, I think it's even it's even more drastic from that perspective. But Lou, I think you had something you want to share.
I was just going to comment on John. You said Wales, Philadelphia, and I just started queuing up the
Fresh Prince.
Yeah,
there you go.
Yeah, it was in that part of West Philly. So yeah, it's just there's so many funny stories about that. But yeah. So that's still home for me. My parents still live there, but yeah.
So I want to kind of talking a little bit more about, let's say, the Asian umbrella. I'm going to bubble up kind of to a macro level. For those that are looking at the news and the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes has definitely kind of reached what I feel is an inflection point, or at least there's more attention that's being put on this as of late. I want to gauge how is this impacting each of you personally, and what are your thoughts around this? I know it's a bit of a loaded topic, but I'd love to hear what y'all can share about the state of affairs that we're currently going through, and what are some maybe ways that we can handle this. Kathy, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've been hyper conscious of it since the start of the pandemic, with all the language going around and whatever else, and living and working in a big city. The story I remember very specifically is an Asian woman was spit on in Penn Station. This was probably early March last year. And it was very terrifying for me. So I went through Penn Station every single day and thinking about, well, what would I have done in that scenario? Fast forward to, just a few weeks ago and the situation in Atlanta, all I could think about was my daughter, my 13-year-old daughter, going out into the world, and how could I make it safe for her in a space where, she's trying to be independent and flexing her muscles and knowing all the things that we've taught her. But yeah, at the same time, I can't protect her from just random acts of violence. Or my dad, my 86-year-old dad, for that matter, living in LA, wanting to go out and hang out with his buddies and play mahjong, go to dim sum. How can we protect them from that? So in many ways, it was great that there's more media coverage, but then in other ways, it caused more worry that there was so much more media coverage to give ideas to people about what was happening or what they could do to really helpless people. And so I thought about it from that perspective and what I could do. And then for myself of, well, how am I going to ever feel comfortable taking the train back into New York again and going to work and feeling productive without constantly looking over my shoulder, which I had been doing already, but just now it feels scarier to the extent of me feeling, I've had moments of feeling super helpless and worried, and then other times of feeling like, well, this is a moment in time where we have to make change and we have to invest in our own community.
John, what about you? Any thoughts on the topic?
Yeah, I mean, I know we've had different forums and unforums, and there'll be more forums, and I think those are all good things. I think for me, a lot of it is that we need institutional change. And so for me, that's sort of where my mind goes. I think there is similar, like I've got parents that are in their late 70s and things like that. So and you check in probably on them a bit more than you would have before. I'm not the calling type for my parents, but like recently I called my dad. So like you do things that you normally wouldn't do because obviously you're concerned about their well-being. They live on their own. And then in another facet, I think you're also just a bit pissed off, at what's going on. So you want to do something. But I think ultimately what that leads me to is, how do you get institutional change? Because things like safety, things like preventing what's happened in Atlanta, preventing not just for the Asian community, but for communities at large, it's not going to come about by just addressing and incarcerating the people responsible for that one incident. And so I think for me, it's been a lot about, what are we doing in the lobby group? What are we doing institutionally to try to impact change? Because I think in a lot of ways, there's not enough of that. And so that's where my mind has sort of led in terms of even as RAP, as an organization, what we're trying to do, like how do we start to bring it up a bit so that we're addressing it in a way that, lasts for the future, right? It's not a flavor of the month. It's not sort of for next month, AAPI month and things like that, but it goes beyond that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel that while sometimes it's hard to see the news, hear it, read about it, in a way, I almost feel like the fact that it's being broadcasted or the fact that it's actually being raised, I feel like is a step. It's a tough step because we don't necessarily have a ton of solutions yet, and we're still on that journey. But I almost feel like there's this bubbled up after being suppressed for a very, very long period of time, and finally, it's getting attention that maybe has. You can only keep something down for so long, and now it's just once it bursts through, how do we go to that next step? Which kind of leads into, there's this myth, and I'm going to call this myth, and I'm going to say quotes, right, where it's called the model minority. And I'm going to read this quote out there. A minority demographic whose members are perceived to achieve a higher degree of socioeconomic success than the population average, thus serving as a reference to outgroups. So that's kind of let's call that a textbook definition. Ryan, what do you think about about this model minority term?
Yeah, this is it's definitely a very complex, complicated question and problem. I think the term obviously in itself is very problematic. I think that, being labeled as a model minority, first of all, right, have to say that the Asian American experience is not a monolith. Like, we encompass such a vast, wide majority of different types of experiences across different, poverty lines and things like that. And so to just say that, oh, the general Asian American experience, look at them, look what they're doing, how successful they are, is super dangerous. And I think the term itself was used as a way to, as a form of suppression for other minority groups to say, hey, look at them, why can't you be like them? And I'll be honest, when I was reflecting on this question, I think that growing up with this term, when I first heard this term, I actually thought it was like a compliment. In high school, I was like, oh, model minority, I guess we're model citizens. And that was actually kind of fueled by, in all transparency, my parents harbored a lot of racism too towards other minority groups. We used to sit at the dinner table and would hear my parents both complain about this ethnic group or that ethnic group not stepping up, saying, hey, we came to this country with nothing, and look at them, why can't they be more like us? And I knew at a young age that was wrong, but it didn't stop the seed from festering and growing into a, maybe you're right. Because I think, I'm proud to be Asian American, but pride can lead to thoughts of being better than others. And I knew that, especially last year, after the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, I had to kind of take a step back personally. Because it's easy, I think, as minorities to say, hey, by default, we're allies, right? Because we're all minorities, so we don't need to necessarily step up in any way. But I knew that I had something inside of me that this harbored resentment or anger that came up every now and then from years and years of talking with my parents and talking even my own community, that I had to kind of sit back and question and say, where have I really kind of leaned into this model minority myth myself? And one of the major things that came out of that sort of reevaluation and listening and understanding is that the Asian American experience, at least, we have obviously our history of persecution and oppression. And don't get me wrong about that, but throughout the story of America, it has been black and white, right? The racism that happens has been predominantly black and white, and we kind of have faded into the background here and there, right? And profited and been able to prosper while, this sort of tension has been happening throughout America. And that's something that, I think we as Asian Americans, we cannot submit or say yes to this model minority. We have to say no to it. I think it's dangerous. And I think personally, right, as Asian Americans, we have to also, combat each other. If you start hearing that within our own circles, saying like, oh yeah, we are, smart, and, look at us getting to Ivy League schools and this and that, like we have to also be smart about saying, no, that's not okay. Because I do think it kind of feeds into the supremacy that is sort of happening in America.
Really, really a great perspective, Ryan. I'm curious too, just when you mentioned talking through with your parents, right? And like, I think many of us have encountered that where like there are, like, I think we talked about inherent biases that already exist as part of that. When hearing about the news or hearing these events that occur, how have the conversations changed, maybe within your families or within others that your friends that you've been interacting with? Kathy or Lou, any thoughts or on that dynamic?
Lou, go ahead.
Thank you, Kathy. No, yeah, and Ryan, thank you for that. That was actually very powerful. But yeah, I think similar to you, Kathy, I think with what's happened, I was, and John, I think anger was my first reaction just for what I've seen. And I saw it last year too. There was a stabbing in El Paso of a young family with a guy with two kids at a Sam's, where someone tried to stab the kids, not just the dad, but the kids. So talking to my parents actually was probably the weirdest conversation I've ever had, because at 42, I've never had to worry about their safety in this country, right? And I actually had to sit back and think about it for myself. Like I knew, these things weren't happening in like, outskirts of some small town or something. They're happening in major metropolitan cities, which you typically think are very diverse and people are a lot more aware, right? But so for me, it was very much a weird conversation of just asking my parents and family, how do you feel? Because I really had no reference point. I knew what I felt, but I didn't know how people were going to feel about it. My mom and dad, my mom is the first one I talked to. My dad, she told me that my dad said, hey, we have to be careful just going to the grocery store. And I had so many mixed emotions about that came out my parents' mouth, because it's just, it made me think about, other minority communities and some of the challenges they face on a day-to-day basis that I just never experienced and they've communicated. And so there was a lot of mixed emotions from kind of worldly view, macro, and then to my family, just feeling angry that my parents have to walk within fear of just going to the grocery store, and feeling hopeless because they live in Oklahoma, and kind of like you, Kathy, where it's like, I don't know how to protect them, and that helplessness, and lack of control was something I had to deal with, and kind of a little bit have faith that they'll be okay. But definitely that conversation was weird. And then at 42, living in Dallas, Texas, wondering, do I need to be careful myself in some ways, right? So I think just having that pause and thought was just awkward for me for the first time in my life at this age in this country. Kathy?
Yeah, surprisingly, my dad was sort of like, I mean, he's 86. He's seen a lot. He's experienced a lot. I mean, he fled the communist war. He came to this country by hook and by crook. And he's sort of like, well, this comes with the territory in terms of being Asian in America, which both made me sad and also a little bit of relief that he wasn't scared, because if he was scared and was also telling me that he was scared, that was going to be a whole different thing. And so whether he was putting a front for it, and he probably was, is one thing. But for me, I was really thinking about, well, there's probably a lot of elderly who aren't quite as brave or bold as my dad. And with them feeling like really the heart of a lot of attacks here, or the target rather of a lot of attacks, it got me thinking about, well, what else I could do. And I found an organization in New York called Heart of Dinner that I've been supporting for a while now. And what they do is bring culturally relevant food to elderly who can't go out on the street because of COVID or whatever else. And they do such great work for this particular community. That's how I was able to channel sort of that anxiety. But also to feel the strength of my dad was also very important. With my brother and sister, they were sort of like, just have to keep an extra eye out for everybody. I don't know, I guess there was a little bit of a pervasive, don't be worried, even though we were probably all very worried about it. Probably tells you a little bit just about the kinds of conversations we have as a family.
Kathy, I wanted to say something too, because my parents had a similar reaction too when we talked about it. I was like so up in arms. I was like, aren't you seeing what's happening in the news? And they're like, oh yeah, it's pretty crazy, huh? And then we just went back to eating. I think one of the things that I'm slowly discovering, right, is, and then, going off of also last year, I talked with my parents about the murder of George Floyd and, even some of the racism that our family harbored, right? I wanted to bring it up for the first time, and it was really awkward. One of the things that my parents said was, we're immigrants, we're not really from here, right? Even though my parents have been here for over 20 years, they vote, they, are law-abiding citizens, but they still see Taiwan as home. That's their homeland. They watch Taiwanese politics just as heavily as American politics. And for them, I think they carry this weight that, I was watching Hassan Minaj's comedy special, Homecoming King, and he had this story about his own parents getting sort of attacked after 9/11. And his dad said, this is the price you pay for being in this country, right? You just kind of have to carry that burden. And I think a lot of immigrants face that too. And I think a lot of the attacks that are happening especially recently with these anti-Asian attacks. A lot of them are immigrants. When you see they're elderly, they're our parents, they're our grandparents. And I think what I've realized is when I talk with my parents about this, they start to realize that it's okay to be angry. Like it's okay to be vocal about it. Because I kid you not, when I talked to my parents about this, they didn't really seem to care. 2 days later, my dad's posting on Facebook. He's sending me, articles about this attack, and now he's like, just up in arms about it too. And I think that is kind of empowering them. And I know that I think one of the burdens that we'll carry as Asian Americans, first generation, second, you name it, is I think we will have to speak up for them, because as immigrants, I think it's going to be really hard for them to feel like they have a voice in this country when they still feel so tied to a country that's their homeland, and they're just like, they feel honored and just privileged to be here. So they're like, I don't want to say anything. I'm going to put my head down. That's also deeply Asian as well, right? Just kind of put your head down, do good work, don't say anything, right?
That transition there, I think, Ryan, one of the points that you made was interesting about, hey, we're here, we're still immigrants, right? And it's like loner status, like we're only going to be here for a little bit of time. When do we feel like we're going to transition out of that, right? Like I do feel, at least from my side, from my family, because my parents came here a little bit earlier, I feel like maybe they got out of that, let's call it the curve, a little bit quicker. And I think maybe by nature of being, in a certain community where they can reach out to other minority groups or other diversity, I think maybe it helped them accelerate that. For other communities, maybe when they're more focused on a Chinatown or a Koreatown, maybe it's less amplified, where they feel in the need to go and interact with others. But it kind of goes back to a question I have is, where is the acceptance of Asians in America? How can we pull that temporary loner status off? Do we have any thoughts about maybe how we can help facilitate that? I'm gonna put John on the spot there.
Yeah, I think acceptance is a tough word, right? So I think in a lot of ways the goal isn't acceptance, it's equity or equality. Because I think in a lot of ways, I think we'll be accepted in different circles and accepted because of who we are personally, what we've done, all those things that are not about the Asian culture. But I think when you talk about race as a whole, I think acceptance often is like much more individualized, right? So I know in kind of a question prep, right, we've listed people, they're accepted because they've got status or they've excelled at their task. But so for me, it's not about acceptance as much as it is about equality, which is, again, an institutional thing. It doesn't matter your background, what you're good at, what your socioeconomic status is, where you live. It's that you have a basic kind of fundamental right to the things that everyone should have. Well-being, safety, ability to get to where you need to get to, all those things. So I think for me, culturally, that's not there yet. So I think, like if you excel at anything, it doesn't matter racially where you're at. If you're like the best of the best, you're going to get accepted. But for me, that doesn't say a lot about where we're at as a country. And I think if you look at equity, equality, you look at, the Harvard stuff that's happened in terms of acceptance rates, and you look at other studies going on about female Asians in senior roles like Kathy's and the lack thereof. When Asians are put into senior roles, it's generally in times of crisis, not in times of prosperity. Like those are all markers that there is an inequality. We're being, in a lot of ways, used or utilized when it's convenient, right? Or when our skill sets are desired. So I think that's what we face as a minority, or all minorities face in different facets. So that'd be my take on it. Like I think we're far from it. I think we're just starting that journey. And I think to what Justin and Lou and Ryan were saying, our parents' generation, the immigrant generation, it was even further, right? Because they couldn't communicate well. They couldn't even be accepted because they couldn't excel in a lot of ways, couldn't speak the language. I think we have some of that now. So how do we make our voices heard? So that'd be sort of my take on it. Just that I'm less worried about being accepted, more worried about sort of as a whole. When we look at statistics across the board, what does it look like?
That's really interesting, though. when we're pulling it back, if we bring us into the workplace in our day-to-day, what are some things that we can do to better build allyship and support inclusivity, not only in the workplace, but in our communities, in our day-to-day? What are some things that we can do better, or how can we promote that?
So I have some thoughts on this one. Being a designer, I think empathy is always the word that is like a catchphrase that everyone says, right? Empathy, empathy. But I mean, we'll start with that, right? I think empathy is the number one thing for any human, for us to just understand other people's experiences. So, I mean, I would first say, like, start by looking inward. You know, don't just say, well, I'm not a racist, right? Like, I don't think these thoughts. I'm better than that. Chances are you've had at some point in time a seed that was planted that is festering and growing, and just challenge that inside of you, right? And just question whether or not any of that exists. Because the only way to start is to admit that something is wrong, right? Something is there that needs to get fixed. I'd say the second thing is, you know, educate yourself. I think even for Asian Americans, we are awakening to the fact that there's this deep history of Asian American struggle that was not talked about in school or glazed over in school. Right, and we're learning so many new things about you know, what's happened throughout history, and that there is so much to stand on. And so I would encourage everyone to kind of read, watch, listen, you know, whatever way they can, to just understand that experience, to better empathize. And then the last thing I thought of is stand up against racism, big or small. I promise you that you are in communities that we aren't in. You know, and chances are somebody will say something in the comfort of their own home or church or community, you know, an off comment like, you know, this or that, right? Don't let it slide. You know, I think sometimes you go, oh, that's just crazy uncle, or, you know, whatever, right? But just say, no, that's not okay. That's not okay. And here's why. It's hurtful. Because I think a lot of these people, and I know my family included, right? I'm not one to say that this is a learning process for my family too, is that we just have to stop it and not say that it's okay, because when they say it and nobody does anything, then it's acknowledged, and then it just continues to grow until it turns into hatred. And I think that's the most dangerous thing. What we're seeing is these attacks are just, it was a seed planted that just kept growing. So do what you can in the work environment or at home, wherever you are, just to be an ally for us and for any minority group, to speak up for them.
I would build on that, Ryan. I think that was great, is to talk to your kids about it. If you have kids in school talk a lot of stuff. And if I just can share with you the experience of my two kids who are only half Chinese. They've had a terrible, terrible experience in school. My son was bullied the entire 7th grade for being Chinese. And my daughter, just one incident at a school table when she was eating a sandwich, and a classmate said to her, oh, you're eating American food today? What prompted that? You know, those things leave an indelible mark on children. And my daughter cried at the kitchen table about that experience and how terrible it was. That was just one thing said to her. So I would encourage everybody to be allies, but really to teach your kids about the Asian American experience, and to really, you know, help us start with those kinds of conversations too, because they're important.
Yeah, I agree. I think you know, with all that's going on now, I've thought about it, and it's really, I feel like what's happened is and the progress that we're going to make going forward is really for our kids and the next generation, right? It's not saying that we won't benefit today, but typically there's a long game with this stuff, right? Because it's changing people's hearts, or changing people, period, is a process, and I think people go through that change curve in their own way. So I agree with you, Kathy. I don't have kids. I'll tell my dog, but you know, I think kids are the future, and if what we go through today as adults pave the way for the next generation, I think it's worth it, right?
It is, and I think part of it too is I feel like the next step will be just kind of finding that common ground, right? Which is where can we have a common conversation? Some of those thoughts or whatever, you know, people are seeing, got to find a way to meet in the middle somehow. I'll share a really quick story. This has stuck with me to this day. Was early, around, I would say, elementary school. I went to a summer camp, and I remember that was probably the first time I ever felt like, hey, I felt different when felt racism against me, which is, I don't want to sit next to the Chinese kid. And as part of camp, it was a sleepover camp. So I know that there was this individual who did not like me, did not want to have anything to do with me. But it just happened that during camp, we had to cook. So, every day they would deliver ingredients. So you had to cook, and you got paired off and said, you have to cook dinner tonight for the entire team. And I remember we got paired together, and I don't know if that was on purpose by the counselors or whatnot, but we sat there and, we couldn't have hated each other more. But lo and behold, there's rice in front of me, and then there was some ingredients like, vegetables and whatnot. And then we kind of started cooking our own dishes. And then we're like, hey, like, what are you doing over there? I'm like, I'm making fried rice. And he's like, I love fried rice, right? So, and it was like, we started sharing that, and it was almost like, wow, like all of a sudden we hated each other, and then all of a sudden, like now we're talking about food, and then all of a sudden, it's not a happy ever after. We didn't become good friends, but at least like then, like it became a little bit less contentious. But it was just that little carrot that was thrown out there. It's like, hey, like, what? I don't have to hate you, but at the same time, like, can we find common ground somewhere? Maybe it's things like food. Maybe it's things like just having a discussion that can, break down those boundaries a little bit. And I think that's a step. And I think those are some of the things that, it doesn't have to be a drastic movement, but at least a little bit of momentum in that direction. I think a little bit counts, and I think that'll accumulate over time.
That's a great story, Justin.
That is a great story. I will add to that, I think, and kind of Ryan, what you were talking about in your story, Justin. I think all of us have a sphere of influence, right? And John, when you said institutional change, I agree. It's at a macro level. We got to get there. But I think, we're a huge population in this country, and we're growing rapidly. And I think if all of us take responsibility for the sphere of influence that we have every day, like that story, Justin, as minute as it might be, you don't know what the impact of that person that you guys bonded on down later in life and what they're going to go do and what awareness they have now, right? And I don't want to underestimate that power of personal connection, because that's really, you hear all these stories, even in the Black community, we watch some of the historical engagements, those moments change people, right? So I think for all of us going forward as Asian Americans in our own neighborhoods, communities, just understand you're an ambassador, and what you say and do is powerful. And don't be afraid to share. Even if people don't understand, there's an opportunity to connect. And I think that personal connection can change people more quickly than trying to, sometimes it feels hopeless to feel like, oh, we have to change laws tomorrow, which we all agree, but I don't know how to do that as an individual, right? But I think empowering ourselves to say, you as an individual can influence and educate others in your sphere of influence at work or at home is a powerful thing. And I want to make sure people understand that's not to be understated.
Thank you so much, thank you everyone here. So we are nearly at time. Just before we wrap here, just wanted to ask through how we feel about our next steps. Do we feel optimistic about the direction we're going? Is it all doldrums? Do we feel like we're making good progress? I'll tee that open to the field for you here.
I'll start. I feel super optimistic. I don't feel like I can feel any other way than that for myself, for my family, for my kids. Because if it were the doldrums, which I love that word, then there wouldn't be anything to do. And I feel like there's so much to do. And even sessions like this or the town halls we're having with the AAPI community through OPMG, it's a great start. I mean, just the power of the collective and the storytelling, and frankly, the community is so wonderful. And I would love to fast forward to a time when there is a national organization that we could all be part of that is having very obvious institutional impact. I think we're some time away from that, but it's something really great to strive for.
I agree.
Yeah, I really want to second that too. I'm optimistic. I'm usually not an optimistic person. This is a shameless plug, but the organization that I'm a part of, Foundation 649, what we are doing is offering scholarships to Asian Americans, and we've just finished another round of collecting essays And I'm reading through these stories and from these young people, and I'm just so excited, right? Like some of these kids are going and wrestling with some questions about race I never did. I came to this realization at a mere 30 years old, and some of these kids are 18, 19, and they're already just talking about race and their place in this country, and they're proud of themselves, and they're proud to kind of speak into that world. And I don't think I was. I was afraid. I was afraid to kind of get involved in politics or even art. That was kind of a big worry for me too. But I'm so excited about this next generation that they're not afraid to speak up. They feel a part of this experiment that is this country, right? And they're telling our stories in really unique ways. So super optimistic about the future.
So fantastic. We're at time. I want to thank each and every one of you, Lou, Kathy, John, and Ryan. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you so much for sharing your stories and your perspectives and what I hope to be one of many conversations that we will continue to have. I would also like to thank the Credera community. Thank you so much for listening and joining us today, and look forward to seeing everybody and continuing to hear the rest of the stories as we continue to make progress on this journey. So thank you, everybody, and hope everybody has a great rest of the day.